envy my dog because he seems to be living in the moment, or she seems to be living in the moment. And I kind of envy that because I spend my whole time thinking ahead. The other thing I think is socialization. And that's key to those two species, and also the point at which a child actually is becoming social and having to interact with other people, because it allows me to not only do time travel, but to do travel into you. So I can have a sense of empathy with you, and I think that's important. So consciousness allows me to imagine being you. And I think that's important. And you can see, actually, there are some cases, I was quite interested to do something about autism in relation to this. You know, because autism does seem to have, it's about an inability to get outside of your eye and imagine being somebody else, and trouble with transferring that. Or schizophrenia is another interesting one, which we didn't look at, but that sense of having two eyes in your brain. And when people have their brain split, sometimes for epilepsy, for example, they do seem to get two eyes. That the brain actually manages to sort of create two identities within the body. So there are lots of kind of interesting issues which we didn't get into. But I think the advantages are about socialization and a sort of ability to master your future.
This may be a difficult question, but...
They're all difficult in this problem, and yeah.
In the button test,
yeah,
what would happen if your conscious mind actually changed your mind?
Well, that's very interesting. In the button experiments, people are starting to talk about not free will, but maybe free won't. That maybe your brain prepares something, and you still have the chance to override it. And frankly, because it wasn't important, I didn't really care whether it's my left or right finger going down. Why should I override that? And so therefore I will just take the decision. And it's also very important to point out here, a lot of people wrote to me, oh, but come on, you have very fast reactions to things. You know, that's not 6 seconds. It's very important how this experiment was set up. It's not, of course, we have very animal reactions. If we're in a car crash, we make decisions. Often those aren't conscious at all. They're they had to bypass, if they had to throw them up in your consciousness. So you do a lot of things instinctively, fast, your brain, this was a very different experiment where, it didn't really matter what I did left or right. But it does seem to be there's a chance to sort of override. So maybe this free won't.
Given what you were saying about identity being tied into the visual, did you do any experimentation with people who were blind?
That's interesting. I mean, I think obviously, visual is not the only sense. So somebody who's blind, I guess, is using so many the other senses to actually, and you can probably play with those. So we didn't do any experiments this one, but in a second program I did about the brain, we had a very interesting experiment with a blind woman. This was about. It was a program about genius, what makes somebody a genius, and we were talking about the plasticity of the brain. And what was very interesting, this woman had been blind her whole life, but she had a system which scanned the visual world around her and changed it into an auditory system. And she was able to, we went around London, it was absolutely extraordinary in this taxi, and she had this, it was just a mobile phone with a camera outside, and she was able to describe to me what was outside the window because it was being changed into, the picture was being changed into auditory waves. And so we went over Westminster Bridge and there was London Eye there. And she said, oh, I can see a circle with dots on it. She'd never seen the London Eye, of course. I mean, she'd never, but, she was able to identify. There's something weird there. This big circle with dots on it. And so it's interesting, I mean, how, and that seemed to be activity that was happening in the visual cortex. So although the visual cortex maybe not being fed through the eyes, it may be that still the visual cortex is very important for a deaf person in actually negotiating her environment.
Okay, right, I understand synesthesia, that blending of the senses and kind of possibly outsourcing areas of the brain to build analogues for different
I mean, this is something we didn't mention the word qualia, which is a very important one in the theory of consciousness, which is the quality of something, the quality of something being red or blue, or why is that different to the sound of a trumpet? And that's actually something that I also got quite excited about this sleep experiment, because this was being done in Madison, and they're actually looking to map experience like red and blue in almost a digital way, zeros and ones, that the brain is encoding these things. And he was asking me, he didn't have the maths, but he said, can you compare the geometry of shapes to say these are very similar shapes, they'll be different. So the way the brain will encode as a sort of high-dimensional shape, red and green, may be close. And I, as a mathematician, can give you a measure of geometrical closeness which would be different from the sound of a trumpet. And maybe what's happening with synesthesia is the way that the brain actually is laying these things down. It's too similar. So you get this kind of swap over that is actually the shape of that thing when it's encoded. It is too similar that you get this kind of...
Sure, this kind of crossover. But I think synesthesia seems to be kind of the root of metaphor of how we combine possibly two things and make a third thing, or express shapes or ideas or perceptions in a different mode.
Yeah.
So creativity probably has a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
We'll just take one more question. Or maybe we've got time for two more. Hang on. Here we go.
Hi. So those are a lot of very interesting experiments, but I've got to express quite a strong note of concern about your interpretation. Right? And that is, all these experiments seem to measure very different things, right? So one is, can people use a mirror correctly?
Yeah.
The other one is, what happens when you pass between waking and sleeping? Then there's how we integrate sensory experience. Now, in an ordinary way of speaking, we talk about all those as somehow involving consciousness, but I don't see you have presented any evidence that anything you're studying was all the same thing, right? Those are all, as far as I'm concerned, completely disparate things until you give some evidence that you're studying this one thing, which is consciousness.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think that's why we're still having a lot of issue with pinning down, well, what is it we mean? So I think that all of these experiments are different ways at trying to look at something which I think that each of those has some relationship to a sense of the I, and it's a different one in different times. But
why are you even talking about the I? That seems like an over-interpretation. Just talk about the tasks at hand. What do people do when you put them onto this task?
Yeah, but are you denying then that there's something that you want to investigate called consciousness?
It seems like there are a whole lot of different things you're investigating.
Yeah, exactly.
I
but
mean,
I'm asking
if you think there's some theoretical unity to them, and you need to provide some sort of argument for that.
Well, I'm saying that there's a lot of argument through the history of philosophy and now science, saying that we think that there's something that is something that we call the I. And you'll say, yeah, okay, well, but and that's what. And you might be right. You might absolutely be right that what will happen is that this I and the sense of consciousness will evaporate like the ether, and you'll say, well, why on earth were you trying to find this thing? It does, it was a false sense of trying to bring things together, and that may be what the result of all of this will be. But what at the moment this is trying to address a philosophical question which has been going on, certainly since Descartes and before that, about trying to identify something which we believe is part of our being. And yeah, I think your questioning of it is totally valid, and it might be that that's the direction. We're oversimplifying things by trying to unify all of these things, and these are just very different experiences.
Sure, possibly we will have to have some kind of pluralistic understanding of what the brain is, or what our kind of conscious locus are, the focus of our identity is. And
I think, it's a very much a measure of our Western attitudes as well, because if I gave this talk probably in India, they would just not quite understand this obsession so much with, I.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to have to end it there. We've got a great talk coming up next as well. It's been a hot line-up today. But Marcus, thank you ever so much for coming. Can we have a big round of applause from the forum? Thank you all.